Hello, my name is David Matthews, and I'm a venture capitalist, and I invest in entrepreneurs. I want to share with you a keynote address I gave recently to a room full of entrepreneurs, mostly women. And it was about a great female entrepreneur of the 19th century, Mary Baker Eddy. It was the second annual gathering of the newly formed National Christian Science Association, and Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Boston-based movement, was in Chicago to support the activity. An overflow crowd of 4,000 people filled every seat in the Music Center auditorium, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Backstage, Mrs. Eddy had just arrived and been informed by the event planners that she would not just be a participant, but indeed was to be the keynote speaker. After a short protest, she gathered herself and entered the stage to a standing ovation that was followed by a deep hush in the room. She then launched into a sermon that has since been described as one of the greatest Christian sermons of the 19th century. As the talk concluded, the audience leapt to its feet, with many members of the crowd rushing the stage. A description from a biographer described the scene thus: "The audience rose en masse and made a rush for the platform. They mounted the reporter's table and vaulted to the rostrum like acrobats. So great was the stampede, the event planners hurried Mrs. Eddy out lest she be swept away." What was it about Mary Baker Eddy that brought her from relative obscurity just 10 years prior to such a level of popularity? Her early life was filled with promise, but in adulthood, a cascading set of challenges brought her to the point of despair. At her lowest point, she read a Bible account of healing and found herself suddenly healed of a life-threatening injury. That moment of discovery at the midpoint of her long life inspired Mary to bring her discovery to the world. Born in 1821 in a hamlet just outside Concord, New Hampshire, Mary Baker was the youngest in a family of 5 children. Her favorite brother, Albert, worked with future U.S. President Franklin Pierce in a law firm, but passed away following a brief illness when Mary was just 20. Mary was introduced to a friend of the family named George Glover, and soon they were engaged to be married. After the wedding, the happy couple sailed to faraway Charleston, South Carolina, to settle and start a family. 6 months later, tragedy struck when George became ill with yellow fever and passed away. Pregnant with their first child, Mary made the arduous trip back to her family in New Hampshire and soon gave birth to her son, George Glover III. A few months later, her saintly mother passed away. Mary was now without her 3 closest relationships: brother, mother, and husband. Mary's grief led to a long bout of illness. Bedridden and unable to care for her infant son, well-meaning family members handed off the child to a neighboring family. Her dad remarried, and Mary found herself no longer welcome in the family home. Desperate to recover her health and her child, she agreed to wed her new stepmother's nephew, Daniel Patterson, a traveling dentist who promised to help her regain her health and her son. He did neither. Soon after, Georgie's caretakers moved far away to the frontier of South Dakota and took the boy with them, telling him that his mother was dead. Mary was devastated. This was followed by 6 years of moving from place to place, with Daniel in and out of the picture. They finally settled in the town of Lynn, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. During those years, Mary gave up on traditional medicine, which had provided no remedy for her, and she began investigating alternative forms of health care. After testing things like allopathy and homeopathy, she had a particular intrigue with a Dr. Quimby in Portland, Maine, who used a form of mental empathy to extract a patient's pains. So far, Mary's adult life had consisted of losing her favorite brother, her husband, her mother, her health, her child, her home, and marrying someone who is ultimately unfaithful. Of these years, she would later write, "God had been graciously preparing me during many years for the reception of Christian Science." Gracious preparation! Then came the falling apple moment. In February 1866, in Lynn, Mary had a severe fall on an icy sidewalk and was pronounced incurable by the attending physician. On her deathbed, she requested her Bible, turned to the book of Matthew, and read the account of Christ Jesus healing a paralyzed man. Suddenly, an inspiration came. All her years of studying the Bible and researching alternative medicine culminated in a realization the healings Jesus and his disciples performed were still quite possible 1,800 years later. Mary was healed in that instant. Not only that, but she went on to enjoy health and vitality for the remainder of her long life. Within months of Mary's healing, Daniel was permanently out of the picture, though the divorce wouldn't finalize for another 7 years. She began writing in an effort to better understand and codify her discovery. That moment in time, 1866, was perhaps the perfect moment for the concept of spiritual healing to gain traction in America. New England's population was largely Protestant and very familiar with the Bible, including the Gospels. The Civil War had just ended and the nation was beginning to heal. The practice of spiritualism had become rampant as fraudsters capitalized on the desire of grieving families to communicate with their dearly departed. Spiritualism, talking with the dead, was a fraud. But spirituality, mind over matter, was the real deal. Finally, the healthcare system of that day had severe shortcomings, and millions of sufferers were being turned away as incurable. These factors created a population that was receptive to spiritual healing. Mary's initial writings were the first to refer to both the fatherhood and motherhood of God. Not surprising, since religious writing up to that time had been dominated by men. Her major work, Science and Health, was published in 1875 and was quite an undertaking for a woman that had been nearly penniless just a few years prior. With such an inauspicious beginning, it's amazing that book went on to sell more than 9 million copies. Soon after her discovery, Mary moved to a boarding house owned by the Clark family. Dinners in that home were frequently followed by seances, and Mary didn't hesitate to point out the vast difference between spiritualism, or ghosts, and spirituality, the Holy Ghost. Lynn was a manufacturing town, specifically shoe manufacturing. Its factories had grown substantially during the Civil War, as thousands of Union troops needed shoes. Several of the boarders at the Clarks worked at local factories, including Hiram Crafts, who specialized in heels. Yes, he was a heel. Hiram would sit next to Mary at dinner and listen to her thesis that there was a science at work in the practice of Christianity. He saw proof of her claims, as one boarder was cured through prayer alone of an infected finger, and another of a severe fever. Hiram became the first of what would later become thousands of students of Christian Science. By the time her book was published, Mary had boarded in over a dozen homes, and her teaching was affecting lives in very positive ways, lifting people from sickness to health, from sin to morality, and from poverty to success. How much should she charge for teaching students? Jesus said, "Freely you have received, freely give." But he also said, "A workman is worthy of his hire." Mary needed money to pay her room and board and to cover the cost of publishing her book. She arrived at the price of $300, an amazingly high sum, as the average person's annual salary in those days was less than $1,000. But it was the pearl of great price, and those who caught her vision were willing to pay. In 1880, Mary was granted a charter for a unique institution of learning called the Massachusetts Metaphysical College. Through it, she codified the teaching of students, and she was able to grant state certificates at the completion of her course. Later, she began teaching teachers that could then take on their own students. The window for one to obtain a charter for that type of college was brief, and hers was the only one ever granted. A very needed advantage, as by this time, Mary had spawned quite a field of competitors. At a meeting of the Christian Scientist Association in 1879, it was voted to organize a church designated to commemorate the word and works of our Master, which should reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. Mary was elected pastor of the new church and continued in that role for the next 10 years. Initial church services were conducted in the parlor of her home in Lynn. But the congregation grew rapidly, moving to larger and larger venues, ultimately to Chickering Hall, a 1,600-seat concert hall in Boston's Back Bay, still there today, very close to the site of what's now known as the Mother Church. By 1883, it was becoming clear that a publishing business was needed to serve as the glue connecting Mary's writing, teaching, and preaching. Also for articles written by her growing body of students, and for the sharing of healings. A publishing company was founded, and its initial publication, a monthly Christian Science journal, was launched. Mary served as its editor for the first 18 months, and as a frequent contributor thereafter. The publishing business expanded over time and eventually employed hundreds of people in Boston and in field offices throughout the world. Imagine having a secret that you can see, but almost no one else can. And you know that secret has the potential to disrupt the world as we know it in a most positive way. Actually, it sounds like a lot of the entrepreneurs I've worked with over the last 30 years. Is humanity ready for your secret? Or is it too early? Or maybe even too late? Mary had a secret to share with the world, but it had to be shared wisely, or she was liable to be dismissed as a crazy dreamer. After all, she was a woman disrupting a man's world in 3 distinct fields: science, theology, and medicine. An early student, Daniel Spofford, was entrusted with the marketing and sales of Mary's book. He tried to market it by getting critics to write favorable reviews to drive demand, but his tactic didn't work at all. What did work was good old-fashioned word of mouth, sales on the part of Mary's growing cadre of students, door to door. When the widowed and divorced Mary married one of her students, Asa Eddy, in 1877, a surprising amount of jealousy and malice rose to the surface, most notably with Daniel Spofford. He began to publicly malign Mary's character and tried to thwart her efforts. He even went so far as to fake his own death, laying the blame on Asa, her husband, who was jailed for the murder, until Daniel emerged alive and well, having been hidden out at a relative's home for a few weeks. What a crackpot. Then there were the copycats. As every successful entrepreneur knows, when you bring something incredibly valuable to market and demand grows, competition grows quickly. After all, charging $300 a student for a 2-week course with a growing waiting list was quite a profitable endeavor. Mary had to emphasize that hers was the only metaphysical college with a state charter, and she had to prove every case of plagiarism, and there were lots. In 1882, Asa passed away after a brief illness. 2 happy marriages that were way too short, and 1 unhappy marriage that was way too long. Asa's memory would be well preserved, though, as Mary's official name from then on was Mary Baker Eddy. Through all these challenges, Mary grew stronger, always rising to a higher level. Most of her early students couldn't keep up and left for one reason or another. But by the 1880s, she was attracting some of the smartest, forward-thinking members of any religious movement. Pastors, lawyers, bankers, writers. In short, thinkers. The first line of Science and Health reads, "The time for thinkers has come," and indeed, they did come. In the 1880s, Mary began dispatching top students to major cities to heal and to teach, and Christian Science began to spread rapidly. The way new believers were attracted was usually pretty similar. A person was deathly ill with something rendered incurable by doctors. A friend or family member mentioned hearing of a book that had cured someone they knew just by reading it. The person then got their hands on Science and Health and was healed. The last 100 pages of the book contained dozens of these testimonials. By the time of her famous keynote in Chicago in 1888, the one I opened with, Mary realized that her rise to fame threatened the sustainability of what she was building. After all, if Christian Science was focused on her personality, how could it continue when she was no longer around? To solve this, she created a bold new plan. In 1889, she made a series of major changes that prepared the movement for growth from thousands to hundreds of thousands and provided a path to sustainability for generations to come. In May of 1889, she resigned the role of pastor and filled it with an experienced new pastor. In June, she retired as teacher. Later that month, she gifted the monthly journal magazine to the National CS Association. She capped off the busy month by moving from Boston back to her hometown of Concord. In September, she dissolved her student association. In October, she appointed a publisher for her writings. Then, she closed her college, literally at the peak of its success, as there were more applications for students at that time than she had cumulatively taught during its first 10 years. In December of '89, in perhaps the most stunning move of all, she dissolved the church, which continued on as a voluntary organization until it was later reorganized into a more sustainable format. She capped off the busy year by having a lot purchased in Boston's Back Bay as a permanent site for the Christian Science World Headquarters. What an eventful year was 1889. While the move to Concord was framed as Mary's retirement from active duty, it was anything but. On the surface, it may have seemed she was wrecking everything she'd worked so hard to build. But in reality, she was elevating her concept, constructive destruction. These changes, and more that followed, elevated her from being a multitask manager to becoming the leader of the movement. Actually, an evolution every entrepreneur should aspire toward in their ventures. With the tactical roles all filled, Mary was then able to focus on leadership from her beautiful new home in Concord, orchestrating major moves, including a revision of her book, ordaining her book and the Bible as the church's permanent pastor, creating a manual for church governance, and greatly expanding the publishing business. During Mary's 21 years of retirement, her stature in the world continually grew, as evidenced by a group of 12,000 followers that met in her backyard one day. As Mary's fame continued to grow, her detractors became more and more venomous in their attacks. But guess what? These attacks only served to increase public interest in Christian Science. The number of books sold, churches opened, and people healed scaled very quickly. Many, if not most, of the attacks were initiated by men, who were indignant that a woman could be gaining so much success in what had up to now been a man's world. Two of her most famous detractors were Mark Twain and Joseph Pulitzer. Twain, made famous by his books, white suits, and sharp satire, wrote enough articles critical of Mary and her new religion to be compiled into a book. His main issues with her were, 1, that she profited from helping people, and 2, he didn't think she could have possibly written Science and Health without help from a more accomplished male writer. Interestingly, though, when his biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, mentioned to Twain of being healed through Christian Science, Twain responded, "Of course you've benefited. Christian Science is humanity's boon. Mother Eddy has organized and made available a healing principle that for 2,000 years has never been employed except as the merest guesswork. She is the benefactor of the age." Wow, high praise coming from a famous detractor. Most people today probably think Joseph Pulitzer was a saint, given the prestigious Pulitzer Prize that's awarded each year for journalism. He was anything but, as he led the movement of yellow journalism that was a precursor of today's fake news. His New York World newspaper specialized in spreading any story that was salacious enough to sell more papers, regardless of whether it was true or not. Pulitzer had an instinct for controversy. And in 1906, after the dedication of the Mother Church Extension in Boston, which is one of the largest churches ever built in North America, an event at which Mary Baker Eddy was not present, he concluded that she had to either be dead or too mentally degraded to be able to attend. After all, someone with that high of an accomplishment must have a very healthy ego, he reasoned. And it was unthinkable she wouldn't be there to relish in the moment. He concluded that Christian Science must be a massive fraud that was being run by a secret cabal in her name. His instincts often proved correct, but when he was wrong, he simply utilized his publishing empire to create the story to back up his assumptions. And this was the case with his vicious attack upon Mary Baker Eddy and her church. In the fall of 1906, 2 New York World reporters descended upon Concord and began looking for dirt. After finding few residents willing to speak with them, they stormed Mary's home and demanded an audience. She willingly met with them, but they afterward falsely portrayed her as completely senile and days, if not hours, from death's door. A front-page article ran in the World the following Sunday that covered Pulitzer's assertions of a senile, decrepit old woman taken hostage by a handful of people that were secretly in control. The rest of the media world, however, took great issue with the article as a morally repugnant invasion of a revered elderly citizen's privacy. Newspapers from Concord to California responded with articles in defense of Mary. Pulitzer was humiliated, and he set a course for revenge. He would settle for nothing less than the complete and total destruction of Mary and everything she had built. His investigators estimated Mary's annual income at $1 million and her assets at $15 million. In today's dollars, that would be about $30 million of annual income and assets of nearly $500 million. Pulitzer contemplated how to attack both her income and her assets. Did Mary tremble with fear just because one of the most powerful men in the whole world was vowing to destroy her? No. A simple message hung on the wall in her parlor. Do right and fear not. She calmly continued with her mission, without fear and without distraction. In early 1907, a U.S. senator in Pulitzer's hip pocket, Senator William Chandler of New Hampshire, sent a litigator to South Dakota to convince Mary's estranged son, George, remember him, that his inheritance was being absconded with by criminal elements. George then became the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit which was dubiously titled Next Friends. The goal of the suit was to find Mary mentally incompetent so that a receiver could be appointed to redirect her assets and income to the benefit of the plaintiffs and, of course, their lawyers. The lawsuit was a complete failure because Mary was mentally competent, as was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Even Senator Chandler was heard to exclaim, "She is sharper than a steel trap." The plaintiffs retracted their case. It was suddenly over. With no small amount of irony, Mary launched the Christian Science Monitor newspaper the following year as a remedy for Pulitzer and his brand of yellow journalism. With perhaps even more irony, this newspaper went on to earn over a dozen Pulitzer Prizes over the next 50 years. Mary passed away peacefully at her home 3 years later. Most of her assets passed to her church, putting it on a firm financial foundation for the century ahead. Incidentally, her son and his family were well treated in her will, inheriting substantial wealth. At the time of her passing, a new branch church was being opened on average every 4 days, almost all of them debt-free. Her leadership during that 21 years of retirement resulted in a structure and governing rules which enabled the church to enjoy solid growth for another 60 years before entering a period of decline. Though you may not have heard of Mary Baker Eddy prior to today, she was without a doubt one of the most successful women in human history. Now, everyone that's worked with me over the past 5 years has been required to read a book called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, one of the greatest entrepreneurs and investors in modern times. In this book, Peter outlines 7 questions that need to be answered in the affirmative to justify an investment. Let's score Mary Baker Eddy and her ideas using Peter's criteria. Disruptive value proposition. In most cases, Mary's patients and students experienced or witnessed the reversal of a condition that the healthcare industry had proclaimed to be incurable. That's very disruptive. Why now? New England in 1866 was solidly Protestant, the Civil War was over, the nation was healing, and the healthcare industry was still in its infancy, and lots of alternative healthcare solutions were emerging. Leadership. Mary had the domain expertise, given her thorough knowledge of the Bible and of many alternative healthcare solutions. She was able to define, create, and perform each management position herself: author, pastor, teacher, publisher, and then subsequently fill each role with competent managers. Monopoly. Monopoly is usually a bad word in business because innovation is stifled. But in Peter Thiel's sense of the term, it's about defining that market segment which derives the most benefit from your solution and owning that segment. For Christian Science, that segment was those patients whose doctors had declared, "There's nothing more I can do for you." Distribution. By teaching great teachers and then dispatching them to large populations in North America and beyond, localized creation of students and branch churches was enabled. Sustainability. By spiritualizing the concepts of church building and governance, the Mother Church was established on a permanent foundation with a self-replenishing management. Democratic branch churches were enabled without limit. Secret question. Mary Baker Eddy made a key discovery. The healing mission of Christianity wasn't limited to the time of Christ Jesus only. It was available to all humanity and for all time. Thank you.